All right, everyone. Thanks very much for joining kind of our webinar, Threats Without Borders, taking a closer look at the cyber threats in the healthcare industry. For everyone that's joining, just kind of a couple quick things. If you have any questions at any point, you can put it into the kind of the questions section of GoToWebinar, and Noah and I will tackle that kind of at the end. Feel free to ask any questions at any points. We're happy to address that. From an agenda standpoint, so let's just kind of take a look at the agenda quickly for this time we have together. First off, going to do just a bit of an introduction there, explain a bit about who we are. So, introduce myself, introducing Noah, a bit brief, just, what is Webhost, what is Media Sonar? And then we're going to kind of take a look at some general stats and some high-level look at the threats arena for healthcare. Then dive into some of the actual real kind of cyber threats together with like screenshots and kind of information about what exactly they are. And then we'll kind of move into a bit of the takeaways and a bit of the ways that, yourselves as organizations and as, threat practitioners can essentially take some of these and build some sort of mitigation, some sort of remediation systems into your organization's behaviors. So without further ado, let me introduce Noah.
Hey everybody, thanks Tyler. My name is Noah and I'm a senior cyber analyst here at Webhost. I first came to know OSINT and web intelligence and investigations while I was serving in the intelligence corps in the IDF. I've done that for 2.5 years. Since I've joined Webhost, I've been 2.5 years in Webhost and I've done countless investigations that are based on dark web monitoring and dark web content, both for internal needs and our customers' requirements and use cases. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I'm also happy to be with Tyler, who will be hosting this webinar with me.
Thanks, Noah. So yes, I'm Tyler. Specifically, my name is Tyler Lochtenberg. So I started my career in healthcare, kind of working on adverse event management software systems. And over the years have essentially worked on building multiple different kind of software platforms around things like brand monitoring, anti-cyber bullying, threat detection, etc. Today I lead strategy for Media Sonar, where we provide solutions for organizations to detect, vet, and validate threats from the web to their organizations. And to do that, we obviously work with some amazing data providers, with Webhost being a key player and our solution for dark web data. Now, before we kind of get into those threats, Noah, can you give us a bit of information kind of about Webhost?
Yeah, of course. So what Webhost does is basically providing data in different fields and from different places in the internet, both from the open web, where we have news, blogs, and discussions that are being crawled, and the dark web, where we crawl different networks such as the Tor network, Telegram, deep web, forums and platforms, and etc. We crawl different site types such as marketplaces, which are extremely popular in Tor network. We crawl chatting applications, free speech, social media, and etc. And we also cover different threats and different risks for organizations, which they pull and query from our repository in order to be used and implemented for any of the following solutions. So we're talking about brand protection. How do I protect my brand? What do people say or plan to threat or hurt my brand? Cyber risk solutions, web and OSINT investigations, and financial fraud solutions, which include obviously leaked credit card information, any kind of refund scams, or anything against bank and financial institutions. So the way we do that is actually pretty simple. It all starts with a discovery, which we do internally both manually, meaning both analysts that are continuously investigating the dark web and know the dark web like the back of their hands, and are finding new sources and the new mainstream sources that we should cover in order to find and detect risks and threats on time. We also have several automatic processes that, based on several indicators, find, discover, and join automatically all sorts of new websites and news sources to our coverage based on our use cases and content of interest. Once we discover those, we kind of develop a customized parser that will keep crawling these sources and retrieve content from them on a daily basis. So we'll have always the most updated content through our repository for our customers to query, investigate, and of course, being alert and monitor any kind of threatening mentions that could come up there. We also enriched our data with different entities and entity identification, labeling of data, and etc. And finally, we unified the data into a unified structure in JSON output just to make sure that analytic platforms such as the Media Sonar one will be able to produce the best out of our data and in the easiest way. So with that said, let's hear from Tyler how exactly the Media Sonar platform works. Tyler?
Sure. So the way the Media Sonar platform works is that Media Sonar supports the analysts within your organization by complementing that discovery, vet, and validate process that they're doing. So when a healthcare organization engages with Media Sonar, they leverage our 80,000 plus sources of web information, including the dark web provided by web hosts, to strengthen their security posture. And so this happens in three key areas. The first is the Media Sonar threat model engine allows essentially plug and play detection. You say, okay, here's my assets. Here's the types of threats I'm concerned about. Let's say, for example, information compromise, data breaches, etc. Let me know when there's something that intersects across those that I need to look at. The platform then anonymizes those searches and scours the 4 billion new pieces of monthly content and 60 million new dark web posts a month for that type of information. Now, once that kind of is identified, this is where the second key area really kicks in of the Media Sonar platform, which is a massive performance boost. So if I'm sure everyone kind of reads the different SANS reports, but one of the most recent ones actually showed that 50% of the analysts, et cetera, in an organization are spending about half their time gathering and trying to dissect this intel. And so what we did is within our platform, we brought AI case management capabilities, visualizations, as well as OSINT tools together into a platform, into a part of our platform called Pathfinder, which essentially accelerates that vetting and validation about 30x. And the third part is really strengthening that security posture, because if we're going to evolve as organizations, it has to be a cycle, right? And that is taking the results of what we found in investigation abilities, the entities we've broken it down to, the situation we've broken it down to, and then being able to feed that back into the detection practices that are already in place with your organization. And so at each point of this process, sources like the data from web hosts and coverage of dark web and coverage of the open web and news, blogs, domains, etc., it feeds in to make sure that the right information is at the hands of the analysts at every point and help triage that next step in a faster way. So that an organization can essentially take a look at all these different kinds of alerts or signals coming in and say, look, is this normal business practice, or is this actually something of concern? And speaking of things of concern, let's jump into the next part of our agenda. Let's actually look at the threats arena here.
Right.
Noah?
Yeah, so actually when we're talking about common threats that we're seeing on healthcare institutions, insurance companies, or pharmaceutical companies, we're seeing those main ones. We're talking about illegal branded medication trafficking of the pharmaceutical company that is being traded and sold across dark web marketplaces. We're talking about ransomware attacks and data breaches that are being shared in different hacking forums and in ransomware official websites. Of course, due to the pandemic and the last crazy year that we've had, we're also talking about different COVID vaccine scams or different COVID financial scams as well. Third-party risks on infrastructure. We're talking, of course, about different risks on infrastructure that is commonly used in hospitals or for healthcare companies. And of course, any damage or any vulnerabilities within this infrastructure could be the cause of critical damage to the company. We're seeing those in the form of shares of databases and different hacking forums, as I said, or different chatting applications on a daily basis. We're seeing listings in marketplaces, whether of substances or medication that contain different dangerous substances that are being used for criminal trafficking. Fentanyl is one of the leading ones, and medications that actually contain this dangerous substance are being sold every day in those marketplaces. We're talking about specific requests for medical records and shares of such leaked databases and information, and we see those on a daily basis. And we see that by actors that are sharing or selling or asking for or trading any kind of leaked information that is related to those organizations. And of course, once this is my organization, it's really important that I will know of these actions or these threats on me, so I'll be able to mitigate them better, because when they're not mitigated, there is a very ugly outcome for that, and the numbers speak for themselves. We're talking about more than 93% of healthcare organizations that experienced a data breach between 2017 and 2020. A quick calculation tells us that we're talking about 5 hospitals that will experience a data breach per day during this time. And also every hospital will have at least 1 data breach in a year. Those numbers are immense. We're talking about 28 million leaked records in 2020 alone. We're talking about medical records that contain your personal identifiable information and possibly your medical information. That's as personal as it could get. And finally, we have ransomware groups that are actively attacking hospitals and healthcare medical institutions and etc. The boldest example from the past year was Riot ransomware that attacked 6 hospitals in 24 hours during October 2020. And that can lead to a critical damage when it comes to ransomware attacks that could possibly paralyze those hospital and medical facilities. Since we don't want to come to this, we prepared a few examples of common threats that we're seeing on the healthcare industry, both to show you and raise the awareness of what could be out there. And all of those were just mentioned in the cyber threats arena that I just discussed. So the first one is related to data breaches in the healthcare industry. We actually conducted a quick investigation on recent Pfizer leaks, and we were able to find 2 publications in a very known hacking forum from January 2021. The first one that we're able to see right here is a Pfizer leak that was published in December. These were leaking Word documents, PDFs, email screenshots, and even peer reviews of Pfizer company. And those documents in part were a joint project with the EMA, the European Medicines Agency. And those were related to the COVID vaccines trials and development. So obviously that's extremely sensitive and confidential information of Pfizer that was leaking in a very high profile hacking forum. When we're talking about this next example here, we're seeing leaked Excel sheets from Pfizer that detail the different sales and different customers that they sold products and medications to. We have names of customers and purchase IDs and funds, or the amount of money that was paid for Pfizer. And this example is actually a very nice and classic third-party risk and sort of compliance to those companies that appear in that document, because not only Pfizer is being hurt, and not only Pfizer has to be accountable for this, but also the companies that are appearing in this document will be affected by this leak. That's why it's really important for associated companies with Pfizer to also be aware of those risks. The next example we have is actually related to leaked medical records. In this specific example from January 2021, we are seeing an actor who sells in a hacking forum 120,000 medical records and scans. Those are being used by hackers and are extremely popular and requested for identity fraud, for medical insurance fraud, and sometimes, you know, they hold it and they commit any identity fraud that they can with your information. So any medical facility that is worried about having their patients' data exposed and being abused should be monitoring mentions of his company, as well as mentions of any leaked databases that might be eventually leading back to them. Sorry. The next example we have is related to ransomware attacks in the healthcare industry. So a nice statistics that we kind of uncovered is that ransomware accounts for 28% of targeted attacks on healthcare, which means this is a very common threat on healthcare and medical companies. Cybersecurity researchers also predict that businesses will fall victim to a ransomware attack every 11 seconds in 2021. That's also an amazing statistic. We're talking about like 6 companies a minute being victims to a ransomware attacks. In these 2 examples, we're actually seeing a ransomware group called Aggregator that attacked Dr. Reddy's laboratories and actually published it in a designated website for everybody to download the content that was obtained during the attack. We're also seeing the name in, you know, very capital letters. It is very clear that Dr. Reddy's laboratories were attacked by this ransomware group. And that attack was actually published and caused a shutdown of operations and trials of the, you know, last phases of the COVID vaccine, which this company conducted with Sputnik. So, you know, imagine a hospital being shut down completely for a day. That could cost you human life, and that's no joke. You have to be completely aware of those threats. We also were able to see 2 different ransomware attacks on 2 hospitals, one of them being the Beacon Health Solutions and Nocona General Hospital. Both are based in the US.
Yeah, and you know what, just kind of pulling an example too from kind of my experience working with some of these healthcare agencies is sometimes when you hear these like phishing and these ransomware attacks, et cetera, and you're like, okay, when you're thinking of the different impact, to kind of give an example of what one of these actually looks like, this healthcare organization that I was you know, working with kind of around the security practices at this time, what they had is they actually had a shared Microsoft Drive with a whole bunch of the different providers. This was occurring in the procurement area of kind of the hospital. And with these different drives that they had with the different providers, they would essentially, you know, use that to communicate stock levels and purchases and you know, the transit of multiple different supplies coming into the hospital, from everything from, we're talking about IV-based medications all the way down to single-ply toilet paper. And that was all essentially happening through this communication of shared Excel sheets. And one of the organizations actually encountered a ransomware attack. And that ransomware attack, because it was to a shared file, actually from that way got into the hospital and encrypted all of the drives. So essentially what happened was every time, you know, restoring from backup, as soon as one of those third parties that had hit the ransomware attack opened that back up again, everything would be re-encrypted. And it kept on going on for days and days. And what happened is all the procurement side basically was unable to move forward. They had to sever all connections. They had to switch to doing everything from faxes and phone calls and emails. And over the course of essentially 5 days, they were able to try to get enough workarounds in place to make sure supplies were coming into the hospital appropriately. And those are kind of some of the things that happen from that ransomware side. And especially with hospitals having so many, and other healthcare organizations having so many different partners, really kind of opens that exposure. And I believe, Noah, you actually have an example next about some of those third-party risks.
Definitely, I came prepared. Okay, so the next example is actually related to a smart hospital application, which is used basically to run the day-to-day administrative assignments or records of a specific hospital or medical facility. This was actually discussed in last December, and a vulnerability was discovered in the latest version of this application. The vulnerability was actually allowing hackers who will exploit it to have escalated privileges inside this application. That means that, first of all, they will be able to see any confidential or private information that is stored within this application. The second thing that it says is hackers might be able to run any scripts or any code that they would like that will help them either to damage further the application, to gain more information and utilize this as a data breach. And it could be, catastrophic when we're talking about third-party risks, because any access that hackers might have to this kind of information could affect basically the entire usage of this application to hospitals and facilities that are using it. We also were able to see hackers that discussed this vulnerability in different hacking forums. Sorry. Okay, the next example is actually related to what Tyler said with the file that was sent to the medical company and eventually sort of released the ransomware attack. The human factor is an extremely important one, and awareness of what phishing scams might look like is extremely important, because that is the way that employees in your organizations will be able to stop that. Phishing attacks are the initiator of like 90% of further and worse attacks that are being launched against medical companies and healthcare. We're talking about whether it's SMS phishing scams, as we can see right here, that are directly related to COVID scams or COVID vaccines. The other really interesting example is ExecuFarm. This post is from January 2021, and it was leaking data that was obtained in a ransomware attack in April 2020. The reason that this ransomware attack was possible and was actually a successful one is because of a phishing email that reached company employees, and probably one of the employees, or more than that, didn't recognize that it was a phishing scam and either pressed a link or entered their private information or login information or whatever it was. So that's why it's really important to also educate employees and warn them about those types of attacks, because actually statistics says that 24% of US employees do not feel they are well educated when it comes to phishing scams and how to be careful of them and alert them to higher management in their organizations. So that's also extremely important. And once it is monitored, you'll be able to be careful from that. You'll be able to know whether there is a campaign that is coming towards your company. And those are extremely important as well. The last example that we have is related to trafficking of vaccines, which has become very popular starting April 2020 and still going on today as well. We were able to find both small listings of like 10 shots and up to like bulk listings and sellings of different kinds of vaccinations. We're talking about all brands that are developing and manufacturing this vaccine. We're talking about Moderna, Pfizer, of course, Johnson & Johnson, and even Sputnik, the Russian vaccination. All of those are being offered for sale in the dark web. And the reason it's really important to monitor those and always investigate those is because these companies are eventually accountable and responsible for the way these vaccines are being trafficked, meaning they have to be aware of those posts and eventually verify whether they are true threats and somebody's actually selling and got his hands on 1,000 shots of the Sputnik vaccine, or even if they're fake. They have to be always on control on where their drugs or medications or vaccinations end up. And to do that, one of the things we can do is investigate further the information. One of those ways will be investigating the actors that are behind these posts. And that's what Pathfinder actually does.
Yeah, for sure. So thanks, Noah. So today, as Noah mentioned, yes, any pharmaceutical company, healthcare organization, et cetera, needs to be in control or at least aware of kind of what's happening with medications, what's kind of some of, maybe even for a hospital, what are some of the things that they can expect patients to come in with as a result of some of these. Another example is, earlier on in COVID, there were people who are testing COVID positive that were selling vials of their blood. You can imagine what that would happen, to someone that received it and injected it to themselves, especially after being in the mail for months. Okay, so in criminal investigations, the goal is really to trace and apprehend. In corporate investigations, it's very much more about understanding and mitigating the threat. The effort behind them is actually really similar. So here we'll kind of get an example. So here we had, pulling from one of those previous examples, we had people that were selling essentially, Pfizer medications as well as different kind of tested medications online. And so and this is with the Media Sonar platform, you can imagine, an analyst is doing the steps manually. And looking kind of at that content, looking at that piece of information, there was an email address. That email address can be connected to an online profile. So when we're looking at, what does that investigation path look like? This is something where, you can bring it from some of the like anonymous dark web to uncover exactly how that information expands and what can be done to mitigate it. So in this example specifically, we started off with a dark web vendor ad that had an email address, right? That email address, we used one of the Media Sonar tools, Footprint, to essentially connect that email address with whatever publicly available information had been found in correlation with that, which led us to additional phone numbers. It led us to rough locations like countries and cities, as well as other kind of online profiles. One of those was the Twitter profile. And so we connected that email address to the Twitter profile, and through the Twitter profile, we could identify that this account, under obviously a pseudonym, et cetera, was selling different branded medications and other illegal drugs, right? Driving that traffic back towards those dark web posts. Those Twitter accounts and the different posts all kind of shared a top level surface web or a .com domain. Running that domain and the IP address behind it through some of the tools within the Pathfinder platform also kind of uncovered other domains that were connected, that were hosted together, that were shared and related to that vendor. And through something like the Wayback Machine, which for those not familiar is a whole bunch of, it's kind of caching and snapshots of websites in different point of time, we could take a look and essentially gather not only additional product listings, but phone numbers, and et cetera, going back about 6+ years. And by the way, that whole process was a couple minutes, to go from this anonymous dark web to this full picture of it essentially there. And so now an investigator with that organization can go and see where are all these kind of exposure points essentially that happen and be able to correlate that with activities within the business to be able to understand where is kind of the weak point in, either our organization, inside our supply chain, etc. And Of course that matters, because the fact is that only by really understanding kind of the threats can work be done to mitigate it, right? If I know the patterns of the types of stuff that's exposed and hey, it's matching up with stuff that we've lost, or these kinds of incidents in the past, and a specific facility, et cetera, we can now move into a response area where we're mitigating, we're removing that kind of threat.
Right.
If the same type of information is breached, we can correlate it to, where is that information actually attainable? And, when we can respond to it, we can reduce kind of the overall organization's risk. We can mitigate future incidents. And in the end, we can also mitigate some of the costs, both in impact and fines, et cetera, that come to the organization. And Noah, I think you had some of those. Yep.
Yeah, definitely. And it's important to remember that it's not only money that it costs those companies, it's also reputation, it's also the loss of trust of customers, and it's also the customer base that might grow smaller. So if we take a few of the numbers that we're seeing that actually cost us, the first statistic is $67 million in lost revenues and costs to the UHS hospital. That is one of the hospitals that was attacked by the Ryuk ransomware group in October 2020. That's immense. I'm just thinking about all the equipment and medical staff that could have been bought or paid for with this money. The second number is $7.13 million. That's the average cost of a data breach within the US. And we're reaching $13 billion in general in all 2020. That's also an immense number. When we're talking about fines, those could come up to $100,000, which is an immense number. And when we're talking about those, we're talking both about PCI fines, which are fines that are given to companies that are negligent, with treating and keeping their customers' credit card information, and also HIPAA fines, which are given to companies who neglect their security on medical and insurance documents that are related to medical information. We're talking about up to $50,000 when it comes to those fines to those companies. And again, it's not just the money, it's also reputation, and it's also the loss of trust that it might cost companies that are hurt and not mitigating well enough those cyber threats and cyber attacks.
For sure. And so as we get kind of closer and we get to the point of just answering a couple questions, with all of these webinars, I'd like to really boil down to, okay, well, what's the takeaways? If there's nothing else, if everything else kind of gets lost in the whole mental jumble of the rest of your day, what are kind of some takeaways there to just really hold on to? The first is obviously, phishing training, firewall, security practices, wrangling in that shadow IT, those are all extremely important. The fact is, though, there's all these threats too that are very real, that type to kind of just essentially bypass. They're coming in through different ways. They're coming in through the open web, and they're hitting healthcare pharmaceutical organizations every single day. I do believe, there was essentially, when you look at kind of the average amounts of hospitals and you look at kind of the average amounts of time between breaches, it basically boils down to being either you've been breached this year and you don't know, you're due this year, or well, it's happening, you just don't know it yet. Because roughly it boils down to being once a year, right? The second kind of thing to take away is that you can set up all the kind of systems for capturing and so on, and the fact is that there remains that challenge of separating the threat from normal business operations, which is extremely difficult, and often means that there's a very heavy workload put on the analyst. So supporting the analyst, providing them with the tools, providing them the resources, the information, etc., for them to validate and remediate and strengthen the organization there is very critical, which is why you need that workflow for analysis. You need kind of that step. And the last kind of takeaway, point is that there's hope, right? Once you fully kind of
Always.
understand those points, you can actually strengthen the organization with those kind of learnings. And so the mitigation or prevention relies on essentially the understanding. When from a ransomware standpoint, you have 40 suppliers, and one of those suppliers is essentially popping up as being a threat. You know that you're impacted down the pipe, and you can mitigate that before it kind of reaches you. When you're dealing with essentially a situation in which a new ransomware is coming out, like the Ryuk one, and it's affecting other hospitals, because you're able to see the effect, the damage, what they're asking for, all those kind of elements, you can have that protection plan in advance. And so, essentially, the good news is that, the good guys and the systems kind of available are better. The problems are being solved. The bad news is obviously that these threats are increasing. And so, just like you, I'm sure every day there's a little bit more keeping us up at night. But the good news is there's ways that we can resolve it and mitigate and remediate some of these things.
Definitely, Tyler.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so if anyone does have any questions, happy to kind of answer those questions. Noah and I kind of here, and we'll just wait a few minutes and see what if any questions do come in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the first question I actually see is related to other information that can be found in the dark web. It says, except healthcare breach data, what else can be found on the dark web? So generally speaking, we're talking about any type of illicit activity, starting hacking methods or unauthorized access that can be either sold or shared or asked for, for affiliation programs, and several hackers that are gathering together to commit some kind of operation. We're talking about carding methods and techniques, leaked PII data, which could start with a credit card number and end with any kind of personal identifiable information and doxing. We're also talking about drug trafficking, weapon trafficking. Also, unfortunately, human trafficking is also a large part of the dark web activities that we cover, as well as counterfeit of different, starting banknotes and ending with IDs, diplomas, and certificates. Really, there's no end for illegal activity in the dark web, and we keep on investigating more information that could be of harm to our customers or is trending extremely in the dark web.
For sure. So we do kind of have a question here that came from Monty. Monty says, who would be the target market within healthcare? Well, there's, we can essentially approach that from two ways. So who's the target market for hackers and those trying to get information out of healthcare? And then also, the second question I think that's in there is where does our solutions type of fit best within an organization to mitigate that? Well, from the hackers type of side and from that area, what they're looking for is they're looking for the type of information that people are willing to pay money to preserve. And so hitting them, essentially looking for kind of the weak points in the organization as to where exactly, can we get it where the hospital, in the case of ransomware, they're most likely to pay in order to be able to preserve that data. So health records is a huge one there. And the second one is obviously going really deep into the operations aspect, whether that's in procurement and supply chain, whether that's in, IoT or elements like that, network compromises. The kind of key factor there as well is the fact that it's not just, it's a much more complicated commerce system on the dark web as well. So there is, often the same piece of information is sold over and over and over again. So, it's on from that kind of side, from the hacker type of side, information like patient records, as an example, or trial information, or information that can be used as phishing into other organizations, is obviously at a premium. Going into the second part, which is essentially as to who would be the target market, what is kind of our solutions kind of target market, is really to those operations and kind of the cyber operations and the security aspects of the organization. Essentially, the parts of the organization that are tasked with protecting the most critical parts of the hospital's business type operations, which is, funny enough, the exact areas that the hacker groups are trying to essentially leverage and get into to expose that that valuable type of information. I hope I kind of answered that question for you there, Monty. One that actually came from direct chat to myself is kind of going into from a security standpoint. From a security standpoint, with the data, the answer is essentially that the way kind of platforms like Webhost does, as Webhost finds the information, they have an amazing analyst team, they have some amazing automated technology behind that. They're able to surface the data into essentially a data store, and then the Media Sonar application anonymizes any client-based request and uses and then kind of accesses that data store. So there is kind of a triple layer essentially of anonymity and protection in essentially looking for this information. So the question was more specifically, will a hacker group ever see that my IP from my hospital? The answer is no. That will never happen. You have that safe and you have that protecting aspects there.
Definitely.
Is there anything you want to add to that? Yes.
Yeah, of course. One of the things that I want to add, you have mentioned the analysts team that we have here in Webos and the automatic discovery of different sources within the dark web that are relevant for these use cases. It's really important to say also that the dark web is extremely fluid and extremely, moving very, very fast, meaning we can have one day a large marketplace that everybody uses and everybody knows being seized by law enforcement agencies, or we can have, for example, a very large forum that suddenly goes completely underground and blocks everybody who wasn't registered, or start taking payments for the content that he provides. And it really is important to just be on top of all of those movements and changes, because eventually we want to provide the most popular content and the most mainstream sources, so you'll be able to investigate and monitor and eventually find and alert those threats, because they will be coming, they'll be the most authentic and the most valuable once they're coming from the right sources and not from just a website that nobody uses or nobody knows. And the dark web is immense, so you have to point out those. Okay, one more question that I got is what networks does the darknet include? So that's a really nice question, because the answer keeps changing. We at Webhost cover different types of sources, starting with Tor network, which is like the most known dark network, where marketplaces have been lying for years and hacking forums and etc. We cover content on the deep web with paywalls, captchas, or password protected forums and networks. We cover different free speech social networks, which could also be the potential of the new Black Lives Matter riots or the Million Militia March. We also talk about content from Telegram, Discord, WhatsApp, and different chatting applications that we keep on investigating to see what will be the next trend. Where will hackers or carders or anything like that we'll start talking and where do we need to be as a data provider in order to provide the best data. Thank you for this question, by the way.
For sure. So it seems that we kind of have all the kind of questions that were asked answered here. Anyone has anything else that they'd like to ask? You know, we're definitely kind of always available. You can reach out to either Media Sonar or kind of the web host team for any questions. I'd like to thank everyone kind of for joining. You know, this has been very informative. It's been fun to kind of put together as well. And if you have found this content helpful, if you'd like us to kind of dive into any of the specific things, maybe a specific type of threat or a specific kind of subset of the industry, etc., happy to kind of do that. Just let us know, and we'll talk to you soon. Okay? All right, everyone. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day. Bye.
Have a good one.